He walked into town with a leather sack full of gold and a look in his eyes that no man gets unless something worse than death is breathing down his neck. One offer, one night, one woman brave enough to say yes. In the brutal heart of a Colorado winter, a legendary mountain trapper named Rowan Blackridge did something that made grown men laugh and then go quiet. He offered his entire fortune to any woman willing to marry him before the sun came up. Nobody understood why. Nobody asked the right question. Nobody except her. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. If it moves you, hit like and stay until the very end. This one's worth it. The cold came early that year. Not the kind of cold that bites at your ears and makes you walk a little faster. This was the other kind, the kind that settles into the bones of a town and stays there, heavy and mean, like a debt that won't be paid. By the first week of November, the mountains north of Silver Creek had already swallowed themselves in white. The passes closed, the trails turned to ice, and the people who lived in that valley learned, the way frontier people always learned, that the wilderness didn't care about their plans. Silver Creek wasn't much to look at, even in the summer months. A single main road that turned to mud when it rained and cracked to dust when it didn't. A hardware store, a post office operating out of the back of that same hardware store. 2 saloons, one decent, one not. A bank that everybody trusted slightly less than they should have. A church that everybody attended slightly more than they believed. And a scattering of homes and outbuildings that huddled together as if for warmth. Population, somewhere around 300, depending on the season and who'd died recently. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and most of that business was hard. Rowan Blackridge rode into Silver Creek on the evening of November the 4th, and people noticed him immediately, the way they always did, and not entirely because they were glad to see him. He was a big man, not soft big the way some men got when they had money and comfort, but hard big, the kind built by years of hauling traps through chest-deep snow and sleeping on ground that would kill you if you let your guard down for even one night. He stood somewhere past 6 feet, with shoulders that filled a doorframe and hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same dark wood as his rifle stock. His hair was black going gray at the temples, cut rough, like he'd done it himself with a hunting knife over a creek reflection. His face was weathered in a way that made it impossible to guess his age with any confidence, somewhere between 35 and 50, depending on the light. He had a reputation in that valley, not a warm one, but an honest one. People said Rowan Blackridge had trapped more fur in one season than most men managed in 5. They said he knew the mountain passes the way other men knew their own kitchen floors. They said he'd once walked 20 miles in a blizzard with a broken rib and a beaver carcass over each shoulder, and arrived at the trading post looking more irritated than hurt. What they also said, quieter, and only among themselves, was that Rowan Blackridge was not an easy man to know. He didn't visit Silver Creek often, and when he did, he didn't stay long. He traded his furs, resupplied his provisions, drank one whiskey at the decent saloon, and left before anyone could get comfortable around him. He wasn't rude about it. He just wasn't warm. There was a wall around the man that most people didn't even try to climb, because the look in his eyes suggested that attempting it would be more trouble than it was worth. So when he rode in that November evening and tied his horse outside the Miners' Rest Saloon, the few people on the street gave him the usual nod and went about their business. Nothing unusual. Rowan Blackridge, come to trade before winter locked everything down. What happened inside that saloon, though, that was something else entirely. The Miners' Rest was doing reasonable business for a Tuesday. 6 men at the bar, another 4 at the card tables, the barkeep polishing a glass that would never truly be clean, and a fire in the hearth that smelled of pine sap and wet wool. Nobody paid much attention when Rowan came through the door, other than a quick glance and the usual murmured acknowledgement. He walked to the bar, ordered whiskey, drank it standing up the way he always did, without bothering to remove his coat or his gloves. The barkeep, a heavy-set man named Doyle with a mustache that had seen better decades, refilled the glass without being asked. "Cold out," Doyle offered. "Yes," Rowan said. That was approximately the extent of their conversation for the first 10 minutes. Then Rowan set down his glass, reached into the interior pocket of his coat, and placed something on the bar that made Doyle stop polishing and stare. It was a leather pouch, the drawstring kind, about the size of a man's fist. It hit the bar with a sound that was dense and specific, the kind of sound gold makes when it lands on wood. "I need a wife," Rowan Blackridge said. Not loud, not soft, just stated, the way a man might state that he needed a new pair of boots. The nearest card game went quiet first, then the bar. Then, by some mysterious frontier communication that required no words, everyone else in the room seemed to understand that something worth paying attention to was happening. Doyle blinked. "I'm sorry?" "A wife," Rowan said it again. "Tonight, before sunrise." He pushed the leather pouch forward an inch with 2 fingers. "That's raw gold, roughly $800 worth, give or take, depending on current assay prices. It belongs to whatever woman in this town is willing to marry me before morning." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then somebody at the card table said, very carefully, "Come again?" Rowan turned and looked at the room. He didn't seem embarrassed. He didn't seem excited. He looked, if anything, like a man who had weighed every other option available to him and found them all wanting. "I'm not saying it again," he said. "Word'll travel fast enough." He was right about that. Within 20 minutes, the story had jumped the Miner's Rest and was running through Silver Creek like water finding a crack. By the time an hour had passed, there were more people in the saloon than the fire could comfortably warm, and 2 women from the respectable side of town had already come in with their husbands to see what the fuss was about, decided it was either a joke or a trap, and left. The speculation was loud and varied. "Man's lost his mind," said old Pete Granger, who had lived in Silver Creek long enough to have watched a lot of men lose their minds and considered himself something of an expert on the subject. "Too many winters alone up there. Does something to a person." "Maybe he's dying," suggested the woman beside him, whose name was Clara and who worked at the general store. "Maybe he's got some illness and needs someone to, I don't know, take care of things." $800 is a fortune," said someone else. "That's not the kind of money you offer as a joke." "Maybe he's already got someone in mind, and this is just his peculiar way of proposing. His peculiar way is going to get him killed if one of these women's fathers decides he's making sport of them." Through all of this, Rowan stood at the bar and said nothing. He'd ordered a second whiskey, which he also drank standing up. His face revealed nothing. The leather pouch sat on the bar in front of him, and people looked at it the way people look at things they want but don't trust. A few women did approach him over the course of that first hour. One was young, maybe 17, who came in giggling with 2 friends and asked if it was true what everyone was saying, and then went crimson when he turned those flat dark eyes on her and said yes. It was true. She left without another word. Another was a widow named Martha, who'd been struggling since her husband's death the previous winter, and who stood in front of Rowan with her chin up and her hands folded and asked plainly and without embarrassment what exactly he was expecting in exchange for $800 worth of gold. "A legal marriage," Rowan said. "Nothing else required. After that, you keep the gold and do whatever you want with it." Martha thought about this. She was a practical woman, but something in his face, the flatness of it, the way he kept glancing toward the door as though he expected something terrible to come through it, made her uneasy in a way she couldn't name. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment and then looked away. "Personal reasons." She shook her head slowly and said she was sorry, but no. He nodded like he'd expected that too. By 9 o'clock, the saloon was full, and the mood had shifted from curiosity to something closer to dark entertainment. Men were making bets, not about who would take him up on it, more about whether anyone would at all. The general consensus, voiced by Doyle the barkeep after his 3rd whiskey of the evening, was that Rowan Blackridge had lost some essential screw that was required to function as a normal human being, and that whatever he was trying to accomplish tonight, he wasn't going to accomplish it. Rowan stood at the bar and let them talk. Evelyn Harper came in through the side door at 9:15, which is how she came into most places, quietly, from the less obvious entrance, as though she'd learned early that front doors invited attention she couldn't afford. She was 31 years old, though she looked both older and younger than that depending on the moment. Older in her eyes, which had a permanent tiredness behind them that sleep couldn't fix. Younger in the way she moved, quick and precise, like someone who'd taught herself to be efficient because inefficiency had costs. She was not what men in that town described as a beauty, though she wasn't plain either. She had a face that required looking at twice to understand. Sharp bones, dark hair pulled back in a practical way that had nothing to do with fashion, and a mouth that pressed itself into a line when she was thinking hard, which was most of the time. She ran the Harper boarding house, which had belonged to her father until 3 years ago, when his heart had quit without warning and left her with the property, the debt, and the complete and terrifying knowledge that she had no idea what she was doing. She'd figured it out, slowly and expensively. The boarding house was still standing. She was still standing, but the margin between still standing and gone was thinner than it had any right to be, and lately it had been getting thinner by the month. She'd come to the saloon because her boarder, a young clerk named Thomas, who owed her 6 weeks of back rent, had reportedly been seen at the Miner's Rest all evening instead of at his room, and she'd decided that watching him spend money on whiskey while she went without was a thing she was no longer willing to tolerate. She'd come to collect, or at least to remind him, with her physical presence, that she existed and that he owed her money. She hadn't come for any other reason. She found Thomas at one of the card tables, as expected, looking sheepish and avoiding her eyes, as also expected. She crossed to him, leaned down, said 3 sentences very quietly, watched him go pale, and stood back up. Whatever she'd said, it worked. Thomas began counting out coins from his vest pocket with the urgency of a man whose priorities had been rapidly reorganized. It was while she was waiting for him to finish that she noticed Rowan Blackridge, or rather, she noticed the space around him. The way people in the saloon kept looking at him and then looking away. The leather pouch on the bar. The whiskey glass he kept refilling but not quite finishing. She caught enough of the surrounding conversation to piece together what was being offered, and she stood there for a moment, just taking it in. $800 to any woman willing to marry him before sunrise. Her first thought was the same as everyone else's. He's lost his mind. Her second thought, which followed immediately and with a kind of hard practicality that embarrassed her slightly, was $800 would pay off the bank loan and keep me going for 2 years. She collected the rent from Thomas, folded the coins into her coat pocket, and should have left. She knew she should have left. Every sensible part of her said leave. She walked to the bar instead. Rowan saw her coming. He watched her the way he watched most things, with a stillness that wasn't passivity, but calculation. And when she stopped in front of him, he waited. She didn't introduce herself, didn't ask about the gold or the terms or any of the things that the other women had asked about. She looked at him for a long moment with those tired, sharp eyes, and then she said, "Who's waiting for you up there?" The bar went quiet around them. It wasn't a loud quiet, more like the sound an ear makes when it suddenly decides to pay very careful attention. Something moved across Rowan Blackridge's face. It was small and fast, and if Evelyn had been looking anywhere else, she'd have missed it. A flicker of something raw, quickly covered, like a window being shuttered against wind. In the 3 seconds it took him to compose his expression back to blankness, she saw what nobody else in that room had thought to look for. He wasn't desperate. He was scared. Not for himself. That was the thing. It clearly wasn't himself he was scared for. She'd seen plenty of frightened men in her life, and they all had a particular look. A certain pulling inward. The animal reflex to protect the self. This wasn't that. This was something pointed outward, focused on something or someone that wasn't in this room, and whatever it was enough to drive a man like Rowan Blackridge into a town he preferred to avoid and offer $800 in gold to a room full of strangers. He didn't answer her immediately. He looked at her like he was trying to decide something. "You're the Harper woman," he said finally. "The boarding house." "Yes." "You're in debt. Most people in this town are in debt. Yours is about to come due." He said it without cruelty. Just a fact. She didn't flinch. "Most things come due eventually. You didn't answer my question." He picked up his whiskey glass, looked at it, set it back down without drinking, turned it in a slow circle with 2 fingers. Around them, the saloon had achieved that particular density of silence that a crowd gets when it's trying very hard to pretend it isn't listening. "It's not a who," he said. "It's a who and a situation. And the situation is—" He stopped, started again. "There's someone who needs protection that I can't provide alone. Not legally." His jaw tightened. "I need a wife. It's not for companionship. It's a legal arrangement. There are papers. The marriage needs to be real enough to hold up in a court if it comes to that." "A court?" Evelyn repeated. "Yes. So you're in some kind of legal trouble." Not me. Not yet. The way he said not yet told her something. She looked at him for a long moment. The sensible parts of her were still saying leave. The part of her that had kept a boarding house alive for 3 years through nothing but sheer refusal to quit was doing something else. It was listening to the fear behind his flat, dark eyes, and it was calculating distances, and it was recognizing something in his expression that she'd seen in mirrors for the past several months. A person cornered, a person who had run out of good options and was now dealing in whatever remained. "The gold first," she said, "and you tell me everything, all of it." His eyes sharpened. "You're saying yes?" "I'm saying I'm still deciding, but I'm not deciding blind." She leaned her forearms on the bar. "You want a wife by sunrise. You've got—" She looked toward the grimy clock above the bar. 7 hours. "I'd suggest you start talking." Rowan Blackridge looked at her for a long moment. Then, with something that wasn't quite a smile, but occupied approximately the same space in his face, he said, "Doyle, she needs a glass." They talked at the end of the bar, slightly removed from the rest of the room. Doyle pretended not to listen. Everyone else in the saloon pretended not to listen with less success. Rowan talked. Evelyn listened. She asked questions, not many, but precise ones, the kind that came from someone who was used to getting the most information possible from the least amount of available material. He answered them. Not warmly, not easily, but honestly, which she valued more than warmth. He had a niece. Her name was Mia. She was 7 years old. Her mother, his younger sister, Anna, had died the previous spring of fever, leaving Mia with no legal guardian. Anna had told him before she died that he was to take the child, that there was no one else, that she trusted him, and only him. What Anna hadn't been able to protect against was Silas Whitmore. "I know that name," Evelyn said. She said it carefully, the way you say the name of a sickness. Most people in the territory do. Silas Whitmore was a cattle magnate, a man who had started with a single herd 20 years ago and expanded through a combination of business acumen, political maneuvering, and the calculated application of violence to anyone who stood in his way until he effectively controlled a significant portion of the grazing land between Silver Creek and the Wyoming border. He had men in local government. He had lawyers in Denver. He had an estate the size of a small town, and the kind of influence that made lawmen look the other way. He also had an interest in Mia. Not in the child herself, Rowan said, and something in his voice made very clear what the alternative to that might have been, and what he would have done about it. "And what comes with her? Anna's land, her father's claim." Evelyn frowned. "What kind of claim?" Rowan was quiet for a moment, then, "Silver." She looked at him. "There's a vein," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear. "Anna and her husband found it, years back, before he died. They filed the paperwork. The claim is legal and registered, but it's tied to the land which is now Mia's, which means whoever has legal guardianship of Mia controls the claim," Evelyn finished. "Yes. And Whitmore knows about it." "Whitmore's lawyers found out about it 3 months ago. Since then, he's been working through the courts to establish himself as Mia's legal guardian. On the grounds that I'm—" Rowan's jaw tightened. "On the grounds that I am not a suitable guardian. I'm unmarried. I live alone in the mountains. I have no fixed property in town. Every argument they make in court is technically legal, and every one of them is a lie dressed up in paperwork." "And a married man," Evelyn said slowly, "with a wife who has property and standing in the community, changes the argument," Rowan said. "Yes." She turned her glass in her hands, looked at it, looked at him. "Where is she now?" "Mia?" "The cabin. My cabin, up in the North Range. She's been there since October. I have a neighbor woman, Mrs. Alderley, who's been staying with her while I came down to—" He stopped. "To find a wife," Evelyn said. "To find a solution." The distinction seemed important to him. She almost smiled at that. Almost. "And Whitmore's men?" she asked. "Are they aware of where she is?" The way his eyes changed was all the answer she needed. "That's why it has to be tonight," she said. It wasn't a question. "I got a message 3 days ago. His lawyers are pushing for an emergency custody hearing. They've scheduled it for a week from now. If I go into that courtroom as a single man, I lose. If I show up married with a wife who owns property in town, it changes everything." He met her eyes directly. I know this isn't what you thought your life would look like. She laughed once, a short, dry sound. No. But then, nothing about my life looks like I thought it would. She straightened. I have conditions. He waited. The gold pays my bank debt. Not the whole 800. I'll give you an accounting, but it's roughly $430. The remainder of the gold stays in a joint account until the legal situation is resolved, at which point we discuss the arrangement. She held up a hand before he could speak. I also need to be told everything, not the version you think I can handle. Everything. If I'm walking into something, I walk in with all the information. That's reasonable. One more thing. She looked him directly in the eyes. Whatever this arrangement is, whatever legal thing we need it to be, the child comes first. Not the claim, not the money, not your reputation or mine. Mia. Something shifted in him. It was subtle, the way tectonic things are. You don't see the ground move, you just feel a faint vibration underfoot, and afterwards things look slightly different. Yes, he said. That's always been the point. She held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment, then shook it. His grip was what she'd expected. Careful. Like someone who'd learned to be careful with things he might accidentally break. I know a judge, she said. He's asleep and he'll be furious, but he owes me a favor and he's honest, which is rare enough around here to be worth something. You know a judge. My father lent him money 20 years ago, and he paid it back with interest and his personal gratitude. She picked up her glass, drained the last of it, set it down. He performs legal ceremonies when correctly motivated. Put on your coat, Mr. Blackridge. He stood up from the bar. He was taller than she remembered, now that she was standing beside him rather than across from him. The leather pouch of gold sat on the bar between them. You can keep it, he said, nodding at the pouch. The whole thing. She picked it up, felt the weight of it, put it in her coat pocket next to Thomas's rent money, which suddenly seemed very small. We'll figure out the accounting later, she said. Let's go wake up a judge. But Judge Harold Carey was, as Evelyn had predicted, asleep and furious to be woken. He stood in his doorway in a nightshirt and a robe that had seen better decades, squinting at the two people on his porch with the expression of a man who has been pulled from the first deep sleep of a long, cold night and is not inclined to be charitable about it. Evelyn Harper, he said. It is nearly 10 o'clock in the evening. I know, she said. I'm sorry, Harold. You don't look sorry. I'm pragmatically sorry. I need a marriage performed. He looked at her, looked at Rowan, who was standing slightly behind her, hat in hand, with the expression of a man making every effort not to intimidate. The effort was only partially successful. Is this a joke? The judge asked. It is not, Evelyn said. It's November. I'm aware. You've known this man how long? Long enough, she said. Harold, there's a child involved, 7 years old. There's a custody hearing in a week, and the law will eat her alive if we don't do something tonight. Judge Carey looked at Rowan again. Is this true? Yes, sir, Rowan said. The judge pinched the bridge of his nose. Stood there in his nightshirt in the cold November air, the wind pulling at his robe. He was a man of some principle, which was why Evelyn had gone to him, and also why she knew this would take another minute. Come inside, he said finally, in the voice of a man who knows he's going to agree to something but is reserving the right to be grumpy about it. Both of you, I'm not doing this on the porch in the cold. The ceremony was brief. Not cold, but brief. There's a difference. Judge Carey performed it in his kitchen with his wife Eleanor as a witness. Eleanor standing at the kitchen table in her own robe with her hair in a braid, watching the proceedings with the wide alert eyes of a woman who had just been handed the most interesting thing to happen to her in November. She signed the document without being asked, then went and put the kettle on because she was that kind of person. Rowan's hand was steady when he signed. Evelyn's was almost steady. She noticed he noticed. Cold hands, she said. Yes, he said. Neither of them was talking about her hands. When it was done, Judge Carey poured them all a small amount of brandy he kept for occasions that required it, and looked at the two of them sitting at his kitchen table. Two strangers who were, as of 4 minutes ago, legally married, with the expression of a man who had seen a great many things in his years on the frontier and was putting this one in a special category. I hope you know what you're doing, he said. Not entirely, Evelyn said. He seemed to find this answer more reassuring than any false confidence would have been. Outside in the cold, they stood for a moment on the judge's porch. Their breath made small clouds in the night air. The town was quieter now. The saloon crowd had thinned, the street was mostly empty, the mountains to the north were invisible in the dark, but present in the way mountains always are. That sense of enormous weight just beyond the edge of sight. Evelyn had $430 in debt, and she had married a man she'd known for 4 hours. "My boarding house," she said. "I need to arrange things. Get the place closed up for however long this takes. There's a woman who can take over the day-to-day. She's been helping me anyway. She knows how it runs." "How long will that take?" "A day. Maybe 2. She looked at him. "How much time do we have?" "If we leave by day after tomorrow, we should make the cabin before the next storm system comes in. It'll be bad. The weather reading up there has been warning for a week." He paused. "But Whitmore's men are—" He stopped. "Are already moving," she said. "Probably." She pulled her coat tighter, looked at the mountains she couldn't see. Somewhere up there in a cabin she'd never set eyes on, a 7-year-old girl named Mia was asleep under someone else's watch. In a wilderness that didn't know or care about custody hearings and legal claims, waiting for the one person in the world who had promised her she wasn't alone. "There's someone who needs protection that I can't provide alone, not legally." She didn't know this man. She knew his reputation, and she knew what she'd read in his face tonight. The fear, the desperation poorly hidden, the way he'd looked at the door every few minutes like he was measuring the time he had left. She knew that he hadn't lied to her, as far as she could tell. She knew that the thing driving him was the child, and not the silver, though the silver was there too, and she wasn't naive enough to pretend otherwise. She knew almost nothing about who Rowan Blackridge was when he wasn't cornered, but she knew what it was to be cornered, and she knew what it meant when someone stood up anyway. 2 days, she said. "I'll have everything arranged." He nodded. Then, with the particular awkwardness of a man who was not accustomed to certain social transactions, he said, "You should know. Mrs. Alderley, the woman staying with Mia, she can be trusted. And Mia is—" He stopped again. "What?" Evelyn asked. "She's had a difficult year." It came out careful, measured, like he was handing something breakable across a distance. "Losing her mother, the disruption. She doesn't talk much anymore. She used to." Evelyn heard what he wasn't saying, the weight he'd been carrying alone up there in the snow. "We'll figure it out," she said. He looked at her. A real look, not the flat evaluation he'd given everyone else in the saloon, but something more unguarded, like a door opened by accident. "I'll pay you back," he said. "Everything." She tilted her head slightly. "We'll figure that out too." She went left toward the boarding house. He went right toward whatever arrangements he needed to make. Their breath mingled for a moment in the cold air between them, and then they were separate again, 2 strangers moving through a November night in a Colorado frontier town, carrying the weight of a decision that couldn't be undone and a child neither of them intended to fail. "Mom!" The boarding house, when she got back to it, was quiet. Thomas and the other boarders were all upstairs and asleep or pretending to be. The kitchen fire was down to embers. The clock on the mantel said 11:40. She sat at her kitchen table for a while in the near dark, with the leather pouch of gold in front of her and the marriage certificate folded in her coat pocket, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she'd done. Not the reasons, which she understood, but the act of it, the enormity, the way it changed the shape of every tomorrow between now and whatever came next. $800 of gold and a stranger's ring, which she didn't have yet because there hadn't been time, which was perhaps the most absurd detail of an evening, full of absurd details. She pressed 2 fingers against the cold leather of the pouch. Mia. She didn't know the child, didn't know her face or her voice or the way she held herself. But she knew what it was to be 7 years old and have your world pulled out from under you by forces too large and indifferent to explain. She knew what it felt like to need someone to stand between you and something that wanted to take what was yours. She hadn't had that. Her father had been many things, but a man who stood between her and the hard world had not been among them. Well, maybe she'd gotten here by a strange road, but here she was. She pulled out a piece of paper and began making a list. Practical things. The currency of a practical woman. What needed closing? What needed explaining to Ruth Ann, who would mind the boarding house? What to pack for a mountain cabin in deep winter? What she knew about the law as it applied to guardianship cases, which was less than she'd like and more than Rowan probably expected. The list was long. She wrote until nearly 1 in the morning when the fire was truly dead and her breath was visible in the kitchen. Then she folded the paper, tucked it beside the marriage certificate, and climbed the stairs to her bed to sleep for the few hours that remained before a new and entirely different life began. She didn't sleep well, but she slept, and that, she told herself, was enough. 2 days later at dawn, Evelyn Harper, Evelyn Blackridge, legally as of 72 hours ago, stood outside the boarding house with 2 packed bags and the address of a bank where a debt was about to be cleared. Rowan was waiting at the edge of town with a horse, a sled, and supplies enough for a 2-week siege. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, but was operating at a functional efficiency regardless. He looked at her bags, looked at her, nodded once. "Ready?" he asked. She thought about it honestly for half a second. "No," she said. "Let's go anyway." The North Road took them out of Silver Creek and into the foot of the mountains as the sun cleared the ridge behind them, pouring cold light across the snow. The town shrank in their wake. The pines closed in. The world got quieter and colder and larger in the way wilderness does, as if it has been patiently waiting for you to step off the edge of the map and into the place where the rules are different. Evelyn watched the trees pass and thought about a 7-year-old girl she'd never met, waiting in a cabin somewhere up in all that white. Rowan drove. He didn't talk, but once, on a long straight stretch of trail, where the snow lay unblemished on either side, and the only sound was the creak of the sled and the breath of the horses, she caught him glancing sideways at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not gratitude exactly, not suspicion exactly, but something in between, something that might, given sufficient time and sufficient reason, become something else entirely. She looked straight ahead at the mountains and didn't mention it. They had a week before a federal hearing would decide the fate of a child neither of them was willing to lose. The mountains waited. Whitmore's men were already moving, and somewhere ahead in the silence of a frozen wilderness, a little girl was counting on 2 strangers who didn't entirely trust each other yet to keep a promise the law had only barely given them the standing to make. The trees swallowed them. The trail narrowed. The cold deepened, and whatever was waiting for them up in the white, they were going to face it. The trail into the North Range was not a road so much as a suggestion, a narrowing of the trees, a depression in the snow that indicated something passable had existed here before the winter buried it. Rowan drove the sled with the particular focused silence of a man reading a text that most people couldn't see, scanning the tree line, the grade of the slope, the way the snow lay on the branches overhead. Evelyn sat beside him with her bags wedged at her feet and her hands tucked inside her coat, learning to read him the way you learn to read any unfamiliar landscape, by watching what it does when conditions change. He was watchful in a way that was different from nervous. Nervous people moved too much, checked things twice, asked questions they already knew the answer to. Rowan was still, and his stillness had direction to it, the way a compass needle has direction even when it isn't moving. Every few minutes, his eyes went to the tree line on the eastern side of the trail, and the third time she noticed it, she said, "What's over there?" He didn't look at her. Nothing yet. But possibly something. Possibly. He shifted the reins in his hands. Whitmore's men know this trail. They don't know exactly where the cabin is. I was careful about that. But they know the general area, and they're not stupid. How many does he usually send? Depends on what he wants done. A beat. Last time it was 4. She absorbed this. And this time? I don't know. That's what bothers me. The trees pressed closer on both sides, the pines tall and dark and loaded with snow that the wind hadn't managed to shake loose yet. The sled moved steadily, the horses working, their breath coming in long gray clouds. The sky above was the particular white that meant more weather coming. Not immediately, but building, the way pressure builds before something releases. "Tell me about Whitmore," she said. Not because she didn't know the broad strokes, but because she wanted Rowan's version, the version built from whatever proximity to the man had shaped his understanding of him. Rowan was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, he started legitimate, not good, but legitimate. Bought out homesteaders who were failing, pushed some, bribed more, built the operation into something real. He paused. The problem with a man like that is he gets to a certain size and the law becomes something he manages instead of something he obeys. He's got the county sheriff in his pocket, 2 members of the territorial legislature. His lawyers they're good. They're the kind of good that makes doing the wrong thing look exactly like doing the right thing, on paper. And Anna's claim, Evelyn said. Anna's claim is real and registered and filed with the Federal Land Office, which is the only reason Whitmore hasn't just... He stopped. Just what? His jaw worked, made it disappear. She understood what he wasn't saying. Federal jurisdiction was the one layer of bureaucracy that Whitmore's local influence couldn't easily reach, which meant the coming custody hearing, filed, she presumed, with a territorial court rather than a federal one, was his angle of attack. The hearing, she said. What court? Territorial, Judge Harmon Peel in Greystone. Is Peel in Whitmore's pocket? I don't know. Probably not directly. But Peel's ambitious, and Whitmore's lawyers are very good at making ambitious men feel that ruling a certain way is simply good jurisprudence. He said the last 2 words with a dry flatness that made clear what he thought of that. The argument they'll make is that Mia has no stable home, no consistent care, no female presence in her life. That I'm unsuitable, single, remote, no fixed property in town. They've already submitted affidavits to that effect. From whom? 2 men from Silver Creek who work for Whitmore, though you'd never know it from the paperwork. A muscle jumped in his jaw. And a doctor from Greystone who I've never met, who apparently conducted an evaluation of Mia's living situation based on nothing, as far as I can tell. A fabricated evaluation. Evelyn was quiet, turning this over. The marriage helps, she said. It addresses the single argument and the female presence argument. But they'll push back. They'll say it was arranged specifically to influence the hearing. It was arranged specifically to influence the hearing. I know, but there's a difference between the truth and what you can prove. She looked at him. You need to demonstrate that this is a real household, that Mia is cared for and stable and has been consistently. She has been. Then there needs to be documentation, records, testimony from Mrs. Alderley. I need to see what you actually have on paper. She paused. Rowan, do you have a lawyer? The silence that followed answered the question. No, she said, not unkindly. You don't have a lawyer. I have... He stopped. I had a man in Greystone I was going to approach, but I haven't had a chance to... That's the first thing we do. Before the hearing, she turned back to face the trail. I know someone in Denver. He's expensive, but he's the kind of expensive that's worth it. I can pay. I know you can. The leather pouch was still in her coat, the part that exceeded her bank debt, though she'd had to advance some of it to Ruth Ann before leaving, and a portion had gone to settle accounts she couldn't leave open. The mathematics of it were something she'd work out later, in a cabin, in the dark, the way she'd worked out most of her difficult mathematics over the past 3 years. The sled moved on. The trail wound through a series of switchbacks as it climbed, and the town of Silver Creek disappeared behind them and below them, replaced by nothing but white and gray and the dark geometric line of the pines. Evelyn found herself thinking about Mia, the girl Rowan had described in fragments. Doesn't talk much anymore. She used to. A child who had learned that the world was not safe, who had gone quiet as a form of protection. Evelyn understood that particular adaptation in a way she might not have, had she led a different sort of life. They had been on the trail perhaps 2 hours, and the light was starting to change in that way it does in the late afternoon in the mountains, flattening, losing its angle, turning the snow from white to a pale gray blue, when the horses suddenly pulled. Not dramatically, not rearing, but both animals lifted their heads and shifted in that particular way that meant their noses had found something their eyes hadn't reached yet. Rowan's body changed. She felt it more than saw it. A tension that didn't look like tension, a settling that was actually preparation. His hand went to the rifle across his knees, not picking it up, just making contact. Stay seated, he said quietly. Don't reach for anything. Let me look. She stayed seated. She also looked. The trees on the eastern side of the trail were still. Too still. In the way trees are too still when what should be moving through them has stopped. A bird that had been working through the upper branches of a pine about 60 yards ahead had gone quiet. A bird going quiet in the woods means something moved it. Rowan brought the sled to a stop. The horses breathed. The silence had texture to it now, filled the way a held breath is filled. "How many?" she asked, very quietly. "Don't know yet." Just as quiet. He was scanning without appearing to scan, his eyes moving in small, deliberate sweeps. "Could be deer." "You don't think it's deer?" "No." She made herself breathe slowly, looked at the tree line, and thought about 4 men, or more, in the pine shadows with cold hands and orders from a man who treated inconveniences the way ordinary men treated weeds, something to be removed before it crowded out what he actually wanted to grow. The shot, when it came, did not come from where she was looking. It came from behind and to the left, a crack that split the mountain air and sent snow falling from the branches above them in a white cascade. And Rowan was already moving, already low and to the side, pulling her down and sideways with one arm as the second shot came, closer, and one of the horses screamed and lunged forward. "Get down! Under the sled!" She didn't argue. She went low and rolled, hit the snow hard enough to knock the breath from her body, and scrambled toward the underside of the sled as Rowan moved in the opposite direction with his rifle, putting distance between himself and the horses because a man near panicking horses is an easier target than a man in the trees. She pressed flat against the cold undercarriage of the sled and tried to count shots and directions. 2 shooters, at minimum. Possibly 3. There was a third position she thought she could identify from the angle of the second round, which had taken a chunk from the top rail of the sled rather than anything living. Rowan was in the trees. She couldn't see him, but she could track him by the absence of sound in the direction he'd moved. He was a man who moved through winter forest the way a fact moves through an argument, without announcing itself. She heard a crack from his rifle. A pause. Voices. 2, maybe, an argument or alarm, coming from the eastern tree line. Then silence again. Then the sound of someone moving fast through snow, coming toward the trail, and Evelyn had approximately 2 seconds to decide what to do before she made the decision to come out from under the sled and stand up with her hands where they could be seen, because the alternative was being caught on the ground. And she'd always functioned better on her feet. The man who came out of the trees was not Rowan. He was thick across the shoulders and young, younger than she expected. And he had a rifle leveled at her with the uncomfortable steadiness of someone who'd done it before and hadn't been told to feel bad about it. "Don't move," he said. "I'm not moving," she said. He looked at her with a complicated expression. She was not quite what he'd expected to find, apparently. "Where's Blackridge?" "I don't know," she said, which was true. "You're traveling with him." "Yes." "Where's he going?" "I don't know that either." Also largely true. The young man's eyes moved to the tree line and back to her, and in that moment of divided attention, something moved in the shadows behind him. She watched the young man's expression go from guarded to blank in a very specific way, and she looked at the ground because she didn't need to see what happened next. There was a sound of impact and weight redistributing and then snow shifting, and then Rowan was stepping over the young man on the ground, not dead from the way he was breathing, just stopped, and he had blood on his left forearm that was darkening his sleeve. She looked at the arm. He looked at it too, briefly. "How bad?" she asked. "Enough," he said. "Not bad enough to matter right now." "That means it's bad enough to matter later." He was already scanning the tree line again. There were 3, 2 in the east, 1 behind us. "The one behind us is running." He said it with controlled frustration, which means he'll report back. "Report what?" "That we were on this trail, that you're with me." He looked at her. A quick, full assessment, the kind soldiers give each other to check for damage. "Are you hurt?" "No." She crossed to him and looked at the arm. The sleeve was torn, and the wound beneath was a gouge rather than a hole, a graze, but a deep one, still bleeding steadily. "This needs to be wrapped. Later." "Now," she said, "you're bleeding on the snow, and blood in the snow leaves a trail, and you just told me someone who knows we're here is running back to Whitmore." She held his gaze. 30 seconds. He stood still and let her wrap his arm with a strip of cloth she pulled from the pack on the sled. using the quick, competent movements of someone who'd been binding wounds since she was 17 and watching her father drink himself into things he bled from. He watched her face while she worked. She didn't look up. "Done," she said. They got the sled moving again. The horse that had been grazed by the first shot was frightened but functional. The round had taken fur and skin from its flank without going deep. Animals are more resilient than people expect, Evelyn thought, as long as you keep moving them and don't let them think too long about what they just survived. She knew something about that too. "They were warning shots," Rowan said, after a mile of silence. "Mostly. 3 men with rifles sending warning shots still means 3 men with rifles." "Yes." He was quiet. "Whitmore's escalating. He's done with legal pressure as his only approach." Another pause. "I knew he would. I just thought we had more time." "How much farther to the cabin?" 5 hours, maybe 6, with the conditions." "Then we don't stop." He glanced at her sideways. "You're not—" He stopped. "What?" "You're not what I expected," he said. She looked at the trail ahead. "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd want to go back to town after the first shooting." "Well," she said, "I've never been back to anywhere before. I don't see why I'd start now." He didn't reply to that. But something shifted in the set of his shoulders. Not relaxation exactly, but something adjacent to it, like a machine that's been running slightly misaligned, clicking into a better configuration. They drove on into the darkening afternoon, through the deep cold and the heavy pines and the silence of a mountain that had been watching this kind of desperation play out on its slopes for a very long time and had formed no opinions about it. The trail climbed, the air thinned, the sky sealed itself from horizon to horizon in an even white that promised snow before morning. She thought about the young man Rowan had left on the ground back there, breathing. "Will he be all right?" she asked. He seemed to know immediately what she meant. "Yes, cold enough to be uncomfortable. Not cold enough to kill him before his friends find him." "You didn't—" "No." She nodded slowly. She wanted to ask how he made that calculation in the moment. The decision about how much force to use and when. She didn't ask. Some things you learn by watching, not by interrogating. The first stars were showing through a break in the cloud cover, faint and cold, when the trees opened and she saw the cabin. It was smaller than she'd imagined, which was not the same as small. A solid low-roof structure built into the slope with the practical ugliness of something designed to survive rather than to be admired. Chinked logs, deep-set windows, a chimney that was currently doing its job with a thin thread of smoke rising straight up in the still air. A wood pile that stood taller than she did ran along the south wall. There was a lean-to for the horses, roughly built but adequate. It was the smoke that hit her first. The smell of it, pine wood and something cooking, drifting down the slope on the air. Then the warmth as they got closer, even before they reached the door. The smell of a fire someone had been tending carefully for a long time. Rowan tied the horses and they came up the short slope to the door and he knocked. 2 quick, 1 pause, 2 more, the pattern of something established and private. A sound from inside. Footsteps. The door opened. Mrs. Alderley was a compact woman somewhere in her 60s with a face creased by mountain weather and an expression that managed to be both relieved and assessing at the same time. She looked at Rowan, looked at his arm, looked at Evelyn. "You made it," she said to Rowan. "We made it," he said. He looked past her into the interior of the cabin. "Is she—" "Asleep," Mrs. Alderley said. She fought it. She's been—" The woman's eyes went again to Evelyn, with the careful look of someone deciding how much to say. "She's been asking for you." Something in Rowan's face changed with a completeness that startled Evelyn. All the hard-earned blankness, the deliberate flatness that she'd watched him maintain through a cold drive, a firefight, a 6-hour ride through deteriorating weather, it simply fell away. What replaced it was the face of a man who was terrified of failing one specific person. "Let me—" he started. "She's asleep," Mrs. Alderley said again, firmly, but not unkindly. "Let her sleep. You'll see her when she wakes." She stepped back from the door. "Come in out of the cold, both of you, and whoever bandaged that arm needs to do it properly." They came in. The cabin's interior was one main room with a sleeping alcove off the back, currently curtained. Small table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot against one wall, the fireplace dominant and well fed. It was not a comfortable space so much as a sufficient one, the kind of space that met needs without apologizing for having nothing extra to offer. On the table was a clay mug and a child's glove, small and worn, lying palm up as though just removed. Evelyn stood in the cabin doorway for a moment, adjusting to the warmth and the smell and the reality of where she was. She'd had 2 days to prepare for this in practical terms. She'd packed, arranged, managed, listed. She had not, in all that practical preparation, spent much time on the fact that she was about to meet a child who had recently lost her mother, whose entire life was under siege by a man she'd never met, and who was going to wake up tomorrow morning to find a strange woman she hadn't asked for sitting at her uncle's table. Mrs. Alderley, who had apparently seen something of what crossed her face, handed her a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed several hours ago and had just been waiting for someone to need it. "She's a good child," the older woman said quietly. "Stubborn, doesn't trust easy, takes after her uncle, which is either a compliment or a warning depending on who you ask." She gave Rowan a look that he accepted without comment. "She'll come around. Children are more adaptable than we give them credit for." "And less adaptable than we need them to be," Evelyn said. Mrs. Alderley looked at her with a reassessment that felt more approving than she'd have expected. "You're the Harper woman." "I was," Evelyn said. "Now I suppose I'm the Blackridge woman. It'll take some getting used to." Rowan, from the corner where he'd been allowing Mrs. Alderley to properly rebandage his arm with the resigned expression of a man submitting to a ritual he knows better than to resist, glanced up at that. Evelyn didn't look at him. The cabin settled around them, the fire working, the cold pressing at the walls without getting in. Mrs. Alderley cooked, which was to say she put a pot that had been waiting on the fire back to working temperature and produced a meal that was simple and adequate and tasted better than anything Evelyn had eaten in a week, though she attributed some of that to the cold and the events of the day. After they'd eaten, after Mrs. Alderley had declared the arm acceptable and settled herself onto the narrow cot with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who'd learned to sleep anywhere, Evelyn sat at the table with what remained of her coffee and the documents she'd had the presence of mind to bring: the marriage certificate, the paperwork from the bank, and a folder of what she'd been able to pull together in 2 days from public records about the Mia's birth registration and Anna's land claim. Rowan sat across from her. He'd been quiet for the last hour, a different kind of quiet than the watchful silence of the trail, turned inward, tired, the way people get when they've been running on urgency and the urgency has momentarily paused. "The ambush today," she said. He looked up. "They'll report where we are, roughly, which means Whitmore knows we made it to the mountain." "Yes." He'll push up the timeline. If he was planning to wait for the hearing, he's not planning to wait for the hearing anymore, Rowan said. He might have been willing to fight it in court before. But now he knows you're here, and he knows what that changes legally. He looked at his hands on the table. Big, scarred hands, steady. A man like Whitmore doesn't lose in courts. Not because the law favors him, because he makes the law favor him. By the time we get to that hearing, he'll have had 2 weeks to work on the judge, the clerk, the witnesses. A pause. The hearing was always going to be a fight. Now it's going to be a different kind of fight. She spread the land claim papers on the table between them. "Tell me everything you know about this silver claim. Where it was filed, when, who witnessed it." He looked at the papers, looked at her. "It's late. It's early yet by the standards of the problem," she said. "Tell me." He told her. It took 40 minutes, and she asked questions throughout. Not the kind of questions that are looking for reassurance, but the kind that are mapping a structure, finding where the joints were, where the weaknesses might exist, what could be attacked, and what couldn't. He watched her take notes in her precise small handwriting, and he said, at one point, "You've done this kind of thing before, reading documents, looking for something." "My father left the boarding house in debt and his affairs in disorder," she said without looking up. "I spent the first year learning what I could and couldn't legally be held responsible for." She paused her writing. "It's a particular education. Expensive. The most expensive I've ever had." She went back to writing. "But useful, as it turns out." The fire crackled. Mrs. Alderley breathed slowly on the cot. Behind the curtain of the sleeping alcove, Mia slept through whatever she was dreaming, in the silence that children make when they've worn themselves out with grief or worry or both. Evelyn found what she was looking for near midnight. It was buried in the land claim documentation, a registration detail, a specific witnessing requirement for submineral claims in the territorial code, and a second document in the folder that she almost missed because it was older and water-stained at one corner. She sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "Rowan." He'd been half asleep in his chair, the way working men learn to rest without entirely disappearing. He came back immediately. "What?" She turned the paper toward him. "Who filed this second witness affidavit on the claim?" He looked at it. Something moved through his expression. I've never seen this one." He picked it up. "This is Anna's handwriting." He looked up at Evelyn. "Where did you get this?" "It was in the folder with the other documents. I don't think you knew it was there." He turned the paper over, read it again, set it down carefully. "What does it mean?" he asked. Evelyn looked at him across the table, in the firelight, in a cabin surrounded by snow and silence, and the particular weight of a danger that had not finished arriving. "It means," she said slowly, "that Whitmore's entire claim, the legal argument his lawyers built, has a foundation problem." She smoothed the paper flat with her palm. "It means Anna knew something she made sure was on record, and either Whitmore's lawyers missed it, or they missed that we might find it." She looked at the document. "It means this case just changed shape." Outside, the wind had picked up. Snow beginning, tapping at the window glass with the patience of something that had done this before, and knew it would outlast whatever was inside. But inside the cabin, something that might have been, cautiously, incrementally, called hope, had just shifted position at the table. The snow that had started tapping at the cabin window overnight did not stop. By morning, it was falling in the serious way that mountain snow falls when it means to stay, thick and windless, the kind that piles rather than drifts, that covers the world in layers and makes everything that existed before it seem like something you might have imagined. Mia woke before anyone else. Evelyn heard the small sounds from behind the curtained alcove, the shift of weight, the particular silence of a child who has woken in the dark and is deciding whether the world outside her sleeping space is safe. She'd been lying awake herself for the better part of an hour, turning the water-stained document over in her mind. And when she heard Mia, she sat up carefully from the narrow cot Mrs. Alderley had vacated sometime in the early hours to take the chair. She didn't go to the curtain. She got up, moved to the fire, added 2 pieces of wood, and put the kettle on. Ordinary sounds. The kind that mean the morning is proceeding normally, that nothing out there is worse than the cold. After a while, the curtain moved. Mia was small for 7, or perhaps exactly the right size for 7, and Evelyn had simply forgotten what 7 looked like up close. Dark hair, tangled from sleep. Her father's eyes, maybe, or her mother's. Evelyn had no way to know. She stood at the edge of the alcove with her small hand holding the curtain aside, and she looked at Evelyn with the flat, careful assessment of a child who had recently learned that new people in familiar spaces were not automatically good news. They looked at each other. Evelyn didn't smile. The wide, forced smile of an adult trying to be liked by a child is one of the most dishonest gestures in the human repertoire, and children know it. She just said, "Good morning. I'm Evelyn. The water's almost hot." Mia looked at her for another long moment. Then her eyes went to the curtain on the far side of the room, the main door, beyond which Rowan had gone out an hour ago to check the horses and the surrounding terrain. Evelyn had tracked him by sound until she lost him in the snow. "He went to check on the horses," Evelyn said. "He'll be back soon." Mia looked at the door, then at Evelyn. Then she crossed the room in her socks and sat down at the table. And that was the beginning of whatever they were going to be to each other. Rowan came back cold and snow-dusted and reported, while removing his coat, that the horses were fine. The snow was 8 inches deep and still coming, and the eastern trail, the one they'd come in on, was already impassable enough that anyone following it would have a significant problem. He said this last part in a tone that was meant to be neutral, and that Evelyn understood was specifically measured not to alarm Mia. Mia, who was watching him with the focused attention of a child tracking the one fixed point in an unstable world, said nothing. She took the cup of hot water Evelyn put in front of her and held it in both hands. Rowan sat across from her, and his entire manner changed in the way Evelyn had noticed the night before. That dropping of the wall, the unguarded quality he had only in this child's presence. "You okay?" he asked. Mia shrugged. "I know," he said. And the way he said it, not as dismissal, not as fix, just as acknowledgement, told Evelyn something specific and important about who this man was when he wasn't being watched by people he needed to perform competence for. Mrs. Alderley made breakfast from what the cabin's stores provided, which was adequate if uninspired, and they ate together at the small table in the snowfall light, and the conversation was careful and practical, and nobody mentioned Silas Whitmore, though his name was in the room the way smoke is in a room, even after the fire is banked. The document stayed on the table between the breakfast things. After Mia had drifted to the window to watch the snow, her small figure outlined against the white light, breath fogging the glass, Rowan picked up the paper and read it again with the attention of someone who needs to understand a thing, not just have been told about it. "Walk me through it again," he said. The legal part. Evelyn sat across from him. The Territorial Code for Submineral Claims has a specific witnessing requirement. 2 independent witnesses to the primary survey, both of whom must be non-related to the claimant and resident in the territory for at least 1 year prior to filing. She tapped the main claim documents. Anna's original filing has 1 witness, a man named Colum Reedy, which is proper and registered. But the secondary affidavit, she touched Anna's water-stained document, names a second witness and includes a notation that a secondary survey was conducted 8 months after the original, which would have been required if the claim boundaries were amended. "Anna amended the boundaries," Rowan said slowly. "She told me. She found more the second year. She extended the claim." "Right. And when you amend claim boundaries, the amendment has to be filed with the same witnessing requirements as the original, and filed at the federal land office, not just the territorial one." He was quiet, working through it. Whitmore's lawyers built their entire legal argument on the territorial filing. The amended claim, the actual current extent of what Mia owns, is registered federally. Whitmore's lawyers either don't know about the amendment, which I find unlikely given how thorough they've apparently been, or they found it and determined no one else would. She looked at him. This document shouldn't have been in that folder. If it was submitted with the federal amendment, there should be a corresponding record in Denver. This looks like Anna's personal copy, the one she kept. "She kept all her papers in a tin box," Rowan said. "After she died, I took everything. I didn't go through it properly. I just kept it." "The tin box is here?" "Under the floorboard in the alcove." Evelyn looked at him. "We need everything in that box." He got up, went to the alcove, came back with a battered tin box that had once been painted green and was now mostly rust at the edges. He set it on the table and opened it, and what came out of it was the disorganized record of a woman's life. Letters, receipts, a child's drawing, more documents, a photograph, a small cloth bag with something hard inside it. They went through it together, piece by piece, while the snow fell and Mia watched it from the window, and Mrs. Alderley quietly did the things that kept a cabin livable. The second document they found, underneath a letter in Anna's handwriting that Rowan put aside without reading, in the private way of someone not ready, was a correspondence from the federal land office in Denver, dated 14 months ago. A confirmation of the amended claim filing, an acknowledgement number, a signature from a federal registrar. Rowan read it twice, set it down. "She knew," he said. "She knew she was sick by then. She was making sure it was all in place." The thought of Anna doing that, filing papers, getting witnesses, keeping copies, making sure her sick hands tied every knot against the people who would come after her daughter's inheritance, sat in the room with a weight that had nothing to do with legal strategy. Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment. Then, carefully, "She did everything right. The problem is that nobody knew to use it. Until now." Until now. She stacked the documents in a careful order. The federal registration means Whitmore's territorial court play falls apart at its foundation. The claim isn't under territorial jurisdiction. He can't use a territorial judge to adjudicate something that's federally registered. She looked at the papers. His lawyers know territorial law. They may be less prepared for federal procedure. "Can we get this to Denver before the hearing? We need to get it to a federal court representative. If there's a federal magistrate's office in Greystone, There is small office. One clerk, I think. That's enough. She paused. But getting to Greystone through this storm is not possible today, Rowan said. Tomorrow, maybe, if it stops overnight. The storm did not stop overnight. It continued through the day and into the following night with the single-minded commitment of weather that has made a decision and intends to honor it. The temperature dropped. The snow reached a depth that meant the horses would struggle, which meant the trail was functionally closed in both directions, which meant they waited. Waiting in a small space with a frightened child and an uncertain future was its own kind of test, and none of them passed it perfectly. Rowan was restless in the way confined men get restless. Not loud, but tight, energy without outlet, too many trips to the window. Mrs. Alderley compensated by doing every possible useful thing she could find to do, which after the first day left her running out of things and growing quieter. Evelyn worked. She organized the documents, wrote notes, thought through legal arguments, and tried not to let the four walls compress her thinking. Mia, for her part, moved through the cabin like weather of her own. Present, then not. Watching, then looking away. On the second afternoon, she sat near Evelyn while Evelyn was writing. Not close, but close enough. Evelyn kept writing and didn't make anything of it. After a while, Mia said, "What are you writing?" Her voice was a surprise, low for a child's and a little rough, like something that hadn't been used much. Evelyn looked up. "Notes about your mama's papers." Mia looked at the documents on the table. Something crossed her face, a flicker of something complicated and barely controlled that only showed for a second before the child smoothed it back. "Uncle Rowan has those." "Yes, we're going over them together." Mia was quiet. Then, "Are the bad people coming here?" Evelyn put down her pen. She thought about the various kinds of answer available and chose the true one. "Maybe. We don't know yet." Mia absorbed this with the seriousness of a child who has been told the truth before and respects it more than comfort. "Uncle Rowan will stop them." "Yes," Evelyn said. "And so will I." Mia looked at her. Another one of those flat, careful assessments. "How?" Evelyn touched the documents. "This is how." The girl looked at the papers for a long moment. Then she reached out and touched the edge of Anna's water-stained affidavit with one fingertip, barely making contact, the way you touch something that might be hot and might not be. "Mama wrote that," she said. "Yes." "She wrote lots of things. She always said—" Mia stopped, swallowed. "She said writing things down was how you made them real." Evelyn looked at the girl, at the careful held-in quality of her, the grief that had gone underground rather than evaporate. "Your mama was right," she said. "That's exactly what this is." Mia took her hand back from the document. She sat there for another minute, and then she went back to the window in the snow, and Evelyn picked up her pen, and neither of them mentioned it again that day. But something had shifted in the quality of Mia's silence when she was near Evelyn. Not gone, not warm, just slightly less defended than before. It was on the morning of the third day that Rowan came in from checking the horses with a different quality in his movement, and Evelyn knew before he spoke. "Riders," he said. He said it low without urgency, but Mrs. Alderley heard and straightened, and Evelyn was already on her feet. "How many?" "I can't tell yet. The snow's still heavy enough to cut visibility, but there are tracks coming up the north approach, the long way, which means someone who knows this mountain well enough to find it, but not well enough to know the shorter line." He was already at the rifle cabinet, pulling down the second gun, checking it. "They'll be here within an hour." "Mia," Mrs. Alderley said, already moving toward the alcove. "Keep her quiet," Rowan said, "and keep her there." Evelyn looked at the documents on the table. She picked up Anna's affidavit, the federal correspondence, the amended claim registration, folded them carefully, and put them inside her coat, against her chest. Rowan watched her do this. He didn't say anything, but his eyes registered it. "If they get past you," she said. "They won't." "But if they do," she said without heat, "I'll have the documents." He looked at her for a moment with that unguarded quality he usually reserved for Mia. Then he nodded once and turned back to the window. The riders came out of the snow at the lower edge of the cabin's clearing like shapes assembling from nothing, the storm giving them up one at a time until there were 8 of them, which was 4 more than before. and they were not making any effort at subtlety. They came in a line, spread across the width of the clearing, and they stopped at 30 yards and waited. Silas Whitmore rode in the center. He was older than Evelyn had expected, mid-60s, she thought, or a hard-lived 55 with the kind of physical confidence that comes from decades of being obeyed. He was dressed well, even for the mountain cold, a long canvas coat and a good hat and gloves that probably cost more than most of Silver Creek's monthly commerce. He sat his horse with the ease of a man who had given orders from horseback his entire adult life and never had cause to question whether they'd be followed. He looked at the cabin, looked at the window where Rowan was standing, looked, and this particular detail registered in Evelyn's chest with a cold precision, at the smaller shadow behind Rowan, which was Mia, whom Mrs. Alderley hadn't quite gotten to the alcove yet. "Blackridge," Whitmore called. His voice carried without effort, deep and conversational, the voice of a man accustomed to not having to raise it. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here for the child. Bring her out and we finish this without anything unpleasant happening." Rowan opened the door, stepped out onto the narrow porch with his rifle in his hands, not raised, just present. "The child's not going anywhere with you, Whitmore. That's not your decision to make." Whitmore's tone didn't change. It had the quality of a man explaining something to someone who was about to understand. "I have a court order, emergency custody, signed and dated. If you'd like to see it—" "The court order you're describing," Rowan said, "is from Judge Peel, Territorial Court." His voice was flat and steady. "The claim you're trying to take her for is federally registered. You know that. Your lawyers know that." Something moved in Whitmore's expression. Not shock. He was too controlled for that, but recalculation. He looked at Rowan for a long moment, and then his gaze moved, almost involuntarily, to the cabin door, because he was a man who had made his fortune by reading situations correctly, and the situation had just indicated that there might be something in that cabin he hadn't accounted for. "Whatever paperwork you think you have," he started. "Doesn't matter to me right now," Rowan said. "What matters right now is that you're on my land with 8 armed men at a cabin where a child is sleeping, and that's something I'm asking you to consider very carefully." The standoff held its breath. The snow fell. The 8 riders sat their horses without speaking, and Evelyn could see from the window the particular quality of their stillness. Professional, but not committed, the way men look when they're waiting to see which way a thing tips before they decide how invested in it they are. She made her decision. She opened the cabin door and walked out. Rowan turned, a sharp, involuntary movement, his expression saying things he didn't have time to put into words. And she walked past him and stood at the edge of the porch and looked at Silas Whitmore across 30 yards of snow-covered clearing. Whitmore looked at her, looked at Rowan. "And you are?" "Evelyn Blackridge," she said. "Rowan's wife. Mia's legal guardian, jointly with my husband, as of 5 days ago." She let that register. "In case your lawyers hadn't updated your information." Something crossed Whitmore's face that she'd have called respect if she thought he was capable of it in its honest form. It was more like the recalibration of a chess player who has realized the board has one more piece on it than he accounted for. "Marriage of convenience," he said. "My lawyers will argue that in court." "They can argue whatever they like." She reached into her coat and withdrew the documents. Folded, slightly warm from being against her body, the water-stained corner of Anna's affidavit visible. She held them up, not opening them, just holding them. "Do your lawyers know about the amended claim filing? The federal registration 14 months ago? The confirmation number from the Denver land office?" Dead quiet. The kind of quiet that Evelyn had learned to recognize over 3 years of managing a boarding house full of people trying to hide things. The quiet of someone recalculating, fast, and not entirely liking the result. "Because if they do," she continued, and her voice was steady, steadier than she'd expected, "then they also know that everything you've built this custody argument on is sitting on a jurisdiction that doesn't apply. And if they don't," she looked at the document in her hand, "then you've spent a considerable amount of money and effort on a plan that had a hole in it the whole time." Whitmore's jaw had tightened. That document could be anything. "It is anything, until it's in front of a federal magistrate." She looked at him. "Which is where it's going the moment this storm clears and this road is passable. Unless something happens to us up here first." She kept her voice even. "In which case the question becomes, what happened to the Blackridge family and who knew where they were? Federal questions tend to get federal attention. One of the riders shifted in his saddle, a small movement, but visible. Evelyn didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Whitmore. "I have 8 men," Whitmore said, quietly. The kind of quiet that is a different form of loud. "I know," she said. "And I have one document that can end your claim to that silver permanently. If I destroy it here, it slows things down. But Anna filed copies. There's a record in Denver. The tin box in that cabin has more." She tilted her head slightly. "You can't burn Denver." A long moment. The snow fell between them, indifferent and consistent. Then one of the riders, a man near the right edge, big in the shoulders, older than the rest, spoke, not to Whitmore but to the man beside him. He said it was a custody dispute. "It is," Whitmore said sharply. "There's a woman standing on a porch with papers," the rider said. "That ain't a custody dispute." "Harrison, I hired on to collect a child per a court order. That was the job." Harrison looked at Evelyn on the porch with an expression that wasn't quite respect, but was definitely not its absence. Shooting a woman holding papers on her own porch is a different job. Whitmore turned in his saddle. The movement was sharp and controlled and barely concealed something that was not. "You'll do what you're paid for." "I'll do what I agreed to," Harrison said. "Those are different things, it turns out." The rider beside Harrison, younger, who'd been watching Evelyn with the expression of someone doing arithmetic, said nothing, but his horse took a half step backward, not at his instruction, just following the animal's reading of the room. Whitmore looked at his men, all 8 of them. And he was a man who had built an empire on his ability to read a room, so what he saw registered, not immediately, not with any outward sign, but in the subtle readjustment of his posture, the way a man stands when he understands that the ground under his plans has changed grade. He looked back at Evelyn. "You're making an enemy," he said. "You made us enemies when you started this," she said. "We're just deciding how it ends." Another moment. Then Whitmore gathered his reins, and in the manner of a man who intends to leave before he is forced to, he turned his horse. He said to his men, without looking at them, "We're done here." Harrison went first, then the others, in ones and twos, peeling away from the clearing and back into the snow. One, the youngest, who'd been the most uncomfortable throughout, caught Evelyn's eyes as he turned his horse. He didn't nod or wave or make any gesture that could later be described as significant. He just looked at her for 1 second with an expression that said, "I understand what just happened, and I'm choosing which side of it to be on." Then the snow took them. Whitmore went last. He stopped at the tree line and looked back at the cabin, at Rowan on the porch with the rifle, at Evelyn with the documents, at the thin thread of smoke from the chimney that meant the fire was still burning and the people inside it were still warm. He looked for exactly long enough to make clear that this was a choice and not a retreat. Then the trees swallowed him too. Rowan's hand found Evelyn's arm. She hadn't realized she was shaking until he did. Not with fear exactly, more with the aftermath of something, the body's way of processing what the mind had been too busy to feel in the moment. "Inside," he said, quietly. Not a command, just a direction. She went inside. The cabin was warm. Mrs. Alderley had Mia in the alcove and came out when she heard the door, her face asking the question her mouth wasn't ready to form. "They're gone," Rowan said. Mrs. Alderley sat down in the chair by the fire and put her face in her hands, briefly, before putting it back and looking like herself again. Rowan leaned his rifle against the wall and stood in the middle of the cabin with his eyes on Evelyn, who had sat down at the table and was staring at the documents in her hands with the expression of someone who has just done something and is only now understanding what it was. "You walked outside," he said. "I know. I told you." "You didn't tell me anything," she said. "We didn't discuss it, and it needed to be done." He stood there. She could feel the argument in him, the part that wanted to point out all the ways it could have gone differently, all the versions of the last 10 minutes where it ended worse. She would have agreed with all of them. None of them were the version that had actually happened. "They didn't shoot," she said, "because they were hired men, not true believers. Because they had a line they weren't willing to cross, and I gave them a reason to find it. And if you'd been wrong?" She looked up at him. "I wasn't wrong." He looked at her. Something in his face was doing things she didn't entirely know how to read yet. Too many things at once, layered, the way a landscape is layered when you look at it from above. The curtain on the alcove moved. Mia came out, still in her socks, her hair worse than it had been in the morning, her eyes moving around the room to take inventory. Rowan, Mrs. Alderley, Evelyn. The documents, the rifle against the wall, the absence of anything that shouldn't be here. She looked at Evelyn. "Did the bad people go?" she asked. Evelyn folded the documents carefully and set them on the table. "Yes," she said. "Are they coming back?" "I don't know, but we'll be ready if they do." Mia came to the table and stood beside Evelyn's chair, not touching, not quite. She looked at the papers. "Mama's writing," she said. "Yes." Mia reached out and placed her small hand flat on top of the stack of documents, not grasping them, just putting her hand there. The weight of a child's palm on her mother's handwriting, on the thing her mother had spent her last careful months making sure was real enough to protect what she loved. Nobody spoke for a while. The fire burned, the snow fell. Outside, the mountain was quiet in the way it gets when the wind drops and everything holds. That specific winter stillness that is the absence of threat rather than the absence of life. Rowan pulled the second chair to the table and sat down. He didn't say anything. After a moment, he reached over and put the tin box back in the center of the table, and they began going through the rest of it. All of them. Evelyn sorting and reading, Rowan identifying, Mia occasionally pointing at her mother's handwriting and saying quietly what something was, because she had sometimes watched her mother write and remembered more than anyone had thought to ask her. The afternoon light changed. The snow thinned. Somewhere below them, Silas Whitmore was riding back down the mountain with 8 men and a plan that had a hole in it that was going to keep getting larger. And in the cabin, around a table covered in an ordinary woman's extraordinary foresight, the family that had been assembled from necessity was quietly, imperfectly, without ceremony, beginning to be real. The storm broke on the 4th morning. It didn't announce itself. Mountain weather rarely does anything so courteous. 1 hour the snow was still coming down in that heavy, purposeful way it had maintained for 3 days, and the next Evelyn looked up from the documents and realized the light through the window had changed quality, sharpened, and the sound of wind in the eaves had stopped. She went to the window and looked out at a world that had been remade in white. The clearing around the cabin smooth and unbroken, the trees bearing their loads of snow with the patient stillness of things that had been doing this for centuries, and expected to keep doing it. Clear sky at the ridgeline, the kind of blue that only exists at altitude in winter. "Rowan," she said. He was already up. He'd slept badly. She'd heard him moving through the night, the creak of the floor under his weight, the sound of the door opening briefly and closing again, the particular insomnia of a man who feels responsible for things he can't currently control. He came to the window and looked at the ridge and then at the trail and then at her. "We can make Greystone by tomorrow afternoon if we leave within the hour," he said. They left within the hour. Mrs. Alderley stayed at the cabin with Mia, a decision that cost Rowan something visible, the leaving of the girl, but which was the right decision, and he knew it. The trail to Greystone crossed exposed ridgeline in 2 places, and whatever remained of Whitmore's interest in stopping them was an unknown quantity that neither of them was willing to expose Mia to again. The cabin was defensible. Mrs. Alderley was a woman who kept a shotgun under the bed and had demonstrated over the previous 4 days a specific unflappable quality that Evelyn had come to respect considerably. Mia stood at the cabin door when they were ready to go, with her arms folded across her chest in the particular way she had of holding herself when she was working not to show something. She looked at Rowan first, and the look that passed between them was the compressed language of people who have built a private vocabulary over months of proximity and loss. Too much said in it to translate accurately for anyone watching from the outside. Then she looked at Evelyn. "You're coming back," Mia said. Not a question, quite, but close enough to one that it required an answer. "Yes," Evelyn said. Mia looked at her with those careful eyes. "People say that." "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm saying it anyway." Something shifted in the girl's expression. Not resolution, not trust exactly, but the beginning of a decision about trust. The way a door doesn't open all at once, but first gives a little at the hinges. She went back inside without another word, which was, Evelyn was learning, Mia's particular form of acceptance. The trail to Greystone in the aftermath of 3 days of snowfall was not a trail so much as an exercise in educated guessing, Rowan reading the landscape beneath the white, the angles and elevations that told him where the ground was solid and where the drifts were concealing drops. The horses moved carefully, picking their footing, and the sled ran clean on the fresh snow, and the world was cold and bright and very quiet. They were 2 hours out from the cabin when Rowan said, without preamble, "What you did on that porch?" Evelyn adjusted her grip on the side rail. "What about it?" "I've been thinking about it for 3 days. "And?" He was quiet for a moment, the reins easy in his hands, his eyes on the trail ahead. "I've been in situations where a thing needed doing, and the person who could do it had to step into open ground to do it," he said. "I know what that costs. In the body, after." He glanced at her. "You were shaking when you came back inside." "I was aware." "You did it anyway." "Yes." He looked at the trail again. "I've known men who couldn't do that. With years of practice and considerably more reason to be confident about the outcome." Another pause. "I want you to know I understand what it was, what it took." Evelyn watched the trees pass. "Whitmore was never going to back down from you," she said. "Not directly. You're the thing he wants to move. Shooting you is complicated. It creates problems he'd rather not have. But shooting you is at least within his existing framework." She kept her voice even. "I was outside his calculation. He didn't have a framework for a woman walking out alone with papers, willing to burn them or not burn them depending on what he did next. He couldn't model it fast enough. That was deliberate. Most things I do are deliberate." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but close. The compressed version that gets out when a person isn't prepared for something to be funny, and it is anyway. They stopped at noon on a south-facing slope where the snow was shallower and ate what Mrs. Alderley had pressed on them before they left. Bread that was 2 days old but still honest, dried venison, 2 hard-boiled eggs that had survived the journey in a cloth-wrapped bundle. They ate standing because sitting in the snow in the middle of a mountain passage in November is a commitment to cold that neither of them was interested in making. "Tell me about the federal magistrate's office in Greystone," Evelyn said, breaking off a piece of bread. "Small, like I said. The magistrate himself is named Ira Connell. He's—" Rowan considered. "He's not corrupt. I don't believe he's corrupt. He's also not brave, which is a different problem." "How do you know him?" "I brought a man to his office 4 years ago, poacher on federal forest land. Connell handled it correctly, but he looked like he'd rather have been doing almost anything else the entire time. He ate a piece of venison. He's the kind of man who does his job when the job is clearly defined and gets anxious when things are complicated." "Then we make it simple for him," Evelyn said. "We put the documents in front of him, and we show him that the only complicated thing about this situation is the one he can resolve by doing his actual job." They reached the outskirts of Greystone late the following afternoon, the horses tired and the temperature dropping hard as the sun went behind the western peaks. Greystone was larger than Silver Creek, a proper territorial town with a courthouse, a telegraph office, 3 hotels of varying quality, and a main street long enough to take a few minutes to walk end to end. It also had, as Rowan had said, a federal magistrate's office, which was a narrow building wedged between a land surveyor and an assay house, with a single lamp burning in the front window. The clerk at the federal office was a young man named Briggs, who could not have been more than 22, and who looked at Rowan and Evelyn with the expression of someone who had been hoping for a quiet Thursday and was now revising his expectations. "The magistrate has gone for the evening," Briggs said. "We'll wait," Evelyn said. "He may not return until—" "We'll wait," she said again, in a tone that communicated clearly that this was not a negotiating position. They waited. Briggs, after a period of visible internal debate, made coffee, which Evelyn accepted and Rowan refused, and at 20 minutes past 7 in the evening the door opened and a man in his late 50s came in, unwinding a scarf, and stopped when he found his front office occupied. Magistrate Ira Connell was exactly what Rowan had described. A man who looked like someone had assembled him from parts of a dozen more decisive men and arrived at an average. Medium height, medium build, thinning hair under a good hat. He had the careful eyes of someone who had spent years in institutional spaces and learned to read rooms quickly as a form of professional survival. He looked at Rowan, and the recognition was there, the memory of a poacher and a cold office 4 years ago. Then he looked at Evelyn, and at the folder of documents she placed on his front desk before he'd finished removing his coat. "Magistrate Connell," she said, "my name is Evelyn Blackridge. My husband Rowan you've met. We have a federal filing matter that requires your attention before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning." Connell looked at the folder, looked at Briggs, who gave the small, helpless shrug of someone who has done what he could. "The territorial court opens at 9, Connell said. "If you have a territorial matter—" "We have a federal matter," Evelyn said, "which is why we're in your office and not the courthouse." She opened the folder and laid the documents in front of him in the order she'd arranged them. The federal registration first, the confirming correspondence second, Anna's original affidavit third. A minor child's federally registered inheritance is currently subject to an emergency custody action in the territorial court filed by a man named Silas Whitmore, whose lawyers either failed to identify or deliberately ignored the federal nature of the underlying claim. The hearing is tomorrow morning. Connell looked at the documents, slowly, with the attention of someone who was hoping to find a reason not to care, and not finding it. "The child's name?" he asked. "Mia. Her mother was Anna Blackridge, who filed the amended claim registration with this office 14 months ago. You should have a corresponding record." Connell looked at Briggs. Briggs, who had apparently recovered himself, was already moving to the filing cabinet along the back wall. After 2 minutes of searching, he produced a file, opened it, compared its contents to the documents on the desk, and looked at his employer with an expression that said, "It checks out." Connell sat down heavily in the chair behind his desk. He picked up Anna's affidavit and read it with the focused unhappiness of a man who can see exactly what his next 12 hours are going to look like and is grieving the simpler version of them. "If this is accurate," he said slowly. "It's accurate," Rowan said, from the corner where he'd been standing with his arms folded, letting Evelyn lead and making no apology for it. "If it's accurate," Connell continued with the slight emphasis of a man maintaining his right to verify things independently, "then the territorial court's jurisdiction over this custody matter is significantly complicated by the federal registration of the underlying asset." "It doesn't exist," Evelyn said. "Territorially. The claim is federal. The custody arrangement that controls access to that claim needs to be evaluated under federal guardianship statute, not territorial. That's an argument for a federal judge, not, you can issue a temporary stay on the territorial proceeding pending federal review," Evelyn said. "You have that authority. It's not a final ruling. It simply requires the territorial court to hold the hearing until the jurisdictional question is resolved by a federal court." Connell looked at her over the documents. "You've done legal work before." "I've done necessary work," she said, "whatever the situation required." A long silence. The lamp on the desk burned steadily. Outside, Greystone went about its evening, doors closing, the distant sound of a piano from somewhere down the main street, a horse clopping past. "Whitmore," Connell said. "He's filed in territorial court." "Yes." "His lawyers are Hargrove and Dean." "I believe so." Connell's expression did something complicated. Hargrove and Dean were, apparently, a known quantity in his professional life, and not a comfortable one. He picked up the federal correspondence again, read it again, set it down. "Briggs," he said, "I need the standard form for a jurisdictional stay of territorial proceedings." Briggs produced the form with the speed of someone who had been hoping to be useful. They were in Connell's office for another hour. He asked questions, careful, precise questions, the kind that mapped the structure of what they were claiming rather than its surface. And Evelyn answered them, and Rowan provided the factual background that she couldn't speak to directly, the history of the claim, Anna's illness, the circumstances of Mia's guardianship. Connell wrote, asked more questions, wrote more. At 9:15, he signed the stay of proceedings and stamped it with the seal that made it, as of that moment, a federal document with the authority to stop tomorrow morning's hearing in its tracks. He held it for a moment before handing it over. "This doesn't resolve the underlying custody question," he said. "That will require a proper federal hearing, properly noticed, properly scheduled." "I know," Evelyn said. "We're not asking for resolution tonight. We're asking for time. You have it." He handed the document to her. Then, in the tone of someone saying something he feels obligated to say, "Whitmore is a powerful man in this territory." "He is," she agreed. "The federal system is not entirely insulated from—" He stopped, chose his next words. It's not a guarantee. Nothing is, she said, but it's better odds than we had yesterday. Connell looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man seeing something he hadn't expected and wasn't quite sure what to do with. Then he nodded, in the manner of someone who has done what he could and is prepared to let the consequences of good judgment work themselves out. They left his office at 9:30. The night was clear and extraordinary cold. The sky above gray stone packed with stars the way mountain skies get, when the air is dry and the light of towns is not quite enough to overwhelm them. Their breath rose in white clouds. The document was in Evelyn's coat next to Anna's papers, inside a fold of oilcloth she'd bought from Briggs for 10 cents. Rowan stood on the boardwalk outside the magistrate's office and didn't speak for a moment. "Tomorrow morning," Evelyn said, "we need to be at the courthouse when Whitmore's lawyers arrive. The stay has to be served before the hearing convenes, or it doesn't stop anything." "I know." He looked up the street, calculating. "There's a woman here who runs a respectable guest house. We can be at the courthouse by 8. She nodded, started walking. He fell into step beside her, matching her pace without adjusting it. The natural accommodation of two people who have walked enough ground together to have stopped negotiating about it. "Connell was right," Rowan said after a block. "The stay buys time. It doesn't end this." "I know." "Whitmore's lawyers will challenge the jurisdiction argument. It could take months in federal court." "Yes." "Expensive months." She looked at him sideways. "Are you telling me you're worried about the money?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm telling you I know what this is going to cost, and you've already—" He stopped. "You walked into this for $430 of debt. What you've put in since then is—" "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "Don't try to settle accounts right now," she said. "There'll be time for that. Right now we have a document that stops a hearing tomorrow and a child in a cabin who is sleeping better than she was a week ago, and neither of those things happened because of a transaction." She kept walking. "So don't." He didn't. They walked the rest of the block in silence, and it was the comfortable kind now. Not the watchful silence of the trail or the tense silence of the cabin under threat, but the kind of silence that exists between people who have run out of the need to perform at each other and can simply occupy the same space without effort. The next morning broke cold and clear, and they were at the courthouse at 10 minutes before 8. Whitmore's lawyers arrived at 8:15. Two men in good coats who had the particular well-rested confidence of people expecting an uncomplicated morning. They saw Rowan first, which caused a visible reassessment, and then they saw Evelyn and the document she was holding, and something in both their faces made the shift from confident to careful that lawyers make when they have just identified an unexpected variable. The stay was served at 8:22. The hearing did not convene. Whitmore himself arrived at 8:40, and Evelyn watched from across the courthouse steps as his lawyers spoke to him in the low, urgent tones of men delivering information that was going to require significant adjustment. He stood absolutely still while they talked, with his good coat and his good hat and the bearing of a man who had not lost many things in his life, and was now confronting the particular texture of being stopped by a piece of paper he hadn't known existed. He looked across the courthouse steps and found Evelyn watching him. She did not look away. She did not smile or gesture or do any of the things that would have made it a performance. She just held his gaze steadily, the way she had on the cabin porch, with the same quality, not defiant, not triumphant, just present, just there and not moving and not going anywhere. Whitmore held her gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at Rowan. Rowan was standing slightly behind and to the left of Evelyn, and he was looking at Whitmore with the flat, dark eyes of a man who has carried a weight for a long time and has finally found somewhere to set it down. Not gone, not resolved, but set down, temporarily, in a place that feels solid enough to hold it. Whitmore looked at both of them for a long moment. A calculation behind his eyes that had stopped being about tomorrow and had become about longer timelines, harder mathematics. He was a man who had built his empire on the principle that everyone had a price and every obstacle had a workaround, and he was now looking at two people who had consistently failed to behave according to that principle, and he was deciding what to do with the information. He turned and walked back to his lawyers, and they went into a close conversation that Evelyn couldn't hear but could read well enough from posture and gesture, recalculating, revising, looking for the next angle. "He's not done," Rowan said low. "No," she agreed. But he stopped. For now, he's stopped. Behind them, the courthouse was doing its ordinary morning business. People coming and going, a dispute about a fence line, a water rights question, the daily machinery of a territorial town working through its accumulated complications, most of them smaller than the one that had just been removed from the steps. Rowan's hand brushed hers. Not a full grip, not deliberate. The contact of two people standing close together, possibly accidental, possibly not. She didn't move away. He didn't move away. "We should send word to Mrs. Alderley," she said. "I'll find a telegraph. And then we go back." "And then we go back," he agreed. She thought of Mia at the cabin door. "You're coming back." The specific weight of a child who has been told things before and has learned what that costs, deciding, against her better judgment, to believe one more time. The mountain waited in the north, white and enormous and indifferent, the way it had always waited, through everything that had happened on its slopes and everything that would happen yet. But there was a fire burning in a cabin up there, tended by a woman with a shotgun and a child who had her mother's stubbornness, and the road back was open, and that, for now, in this moment on the courthouse steps of Greystone, was enough. They rode back to the cabin with the telegraph sent and the stay of proceedings filed and the particular exhaustion of people who have been running on urgency for so long that stopping, even temporarily, feels slightly unreal. The road north was familiar now in a way it hadn't been on the way down. Evelyn knew the switchbacks, knew where the trail narrowed and where it opened, knew the stand of aspens that marked the last exposed ridge before the final descent into the cabin's hollow. Familiarity is a strange comfort. It doesn't make a place safe. It just means you've survived it before, which is close enough. Rowan drove with the quiet efficiency she'd come to recognize as his natural register. Not cold, just conserving. He'd been like this since the courthouse steps, since Whitmore had walked away with his lawyers and his recalculations. She understood it. The thing that had been chasing him for months had not been caught. It had simply been slowed. There's no clean exhale when the danger isn't gone, just repositioned. "What happens next?" she said. "Not a question so much as a place to start. The federal court will schedule a full hearing," he said. "Could be 6 weeks, could be 3 months. Connell said he'd expedite the notice given the minor child's circumstances, but expedite in a federal context doesn't mean fast, it means less slow. Whitmore's lawyers will file a response to the jurisdictional challenge." "Yes, which we'll need to answer." He glanced at her. "I meant what I said about the cost." "I know you did." She'd been thinking about this. The arithmetic of it, the practical shape of the months ahead. Her boarding house was still standing, Ruth Ann managing it in her absence, but the income it generated was narrow even in good months. The gold that remained after the bank debt was a cushion, not a solution. "I know a lawyer in Denver named Aldous Crane. He charges accordingly, but he has federal court experience and he doesn't lose often." "Send him a letter," Rowan said. "I'll cover his fee." She didn't argue. He had the silver claim as his eventual asset, and she had a boarding house and a stubbornness that wasn't legal tender, so the division made practical sense even if her pride had a minor objection that she overruled. They were within an hour of the cabin when the smoke appeared on the eastern ridge. Rowan saw it first. She noticed him go still in that specific way, body attentive before he'd consciously processed what his eyes had found. She followed his gaze and saw it, a thin column, too thin for a campfire, more like something that had been put out recently but was still breathing. "That's not the Alderley place," she said. "No." His voice was careful. "That's the Miller claim. Abandoned 2 seasons back." A pause. "Someone's been using it." They didn't speak about it further. They pushed the horses a little harder for the last stretch, and when the cabin came into view, smoke from the chimney, door closed, no disturbance in the snow around it, Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't been aware was tight. Mrs. Alderley opened the door before they'd finished tying the horses. "I saw smoke on the East Ridge this morning," she said without preamble. "Early, before first light." "We saw it," Rowan said. "One person, maybe 2, using the Miller cabin." "Watching us?" "Possibly." He came up the steps and stopped. "Where's Mia?" "Inside, she's fine." Mrs. Alderley stepped aside to let them in, and there was something in her face, Not worry exactly, more the compressed alertness of someone who had kept themselves very steady for several days and was now allowing themselves to acknowledge how much effort that had taken. Mia was at the table. She had papers spread in front of her. Not the legal documents, which Evelyn had in her coat, but her own papers, a pencil in her hand. She'd been drawing. She looked up when they came in, and the relief on her face was so immediate and unguarded that it clearly surprised even her, because she looked back down at her drawing almost immediately, as if she could retract having shown it. Rowan crossed to the table and sat down across from her without saying anything about the expression she'd tried to take back. He just sat down, looked at the drawing. "What's that?" Mia turned the paper so he could see it better. It was a rough drawing. She was 7, not an artist, but it was recognizably the cabin. 3 figures outside it. 1 tall, 1 medium, 1 small. "That's you," she said, pointing to the tall one. "And that's Evelyn," the medium one. "And that's me." Rowan looked at the drawing for a moment. Something worked in his jaw. "Where are we going?" Mia considered the drawing. "Nowhere," she said. "We're just there." Evelyn took off her coat and hung it on the peg by the door, the document still folded inside it. She stood at the fire and let the warmth reach her, and she didn't say anything, and she thought that the drawing was one of the truest things she'd seen in a long time. Just there. The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that don't make good stories, which is perhaps why they mattered so much. There was no second ambush, like the smoke on the East Ridge had been, as far as anyone could determine, a scout who had reported back and been pulled out after Whitmore's lawyers redirected their strategy toward the federal court. The danger didn't disappear. It changed form, became paperwork, became legal filings, became a thing conducted in offices in Denver rather than on mountain trails. Which was better, and was also its own specific grinding kind of worse, because legal battles are slow in a way that gunfire is not, and the slowness costs a person differently. Evelyn found herself settling into the cabin's rhythms with a practicality that surprised her slightly. She reorganized the stores, not dramatically, just with the small adjustments of someone who has decided they are living somewhere rather than surviving it. She asked Rowan about the cabin's winter needs, and he told her, and she made lists, which he accepted without comment, though she caught him reading one once with an expression she couldn't entirely decode. She and Mia built something together in those weeks that she didn't have a word for. Not maternal, exactly. Evelyn was too honest about her own limitations to reach for that word, and Mia was too recently her own mother's daughter to offer that territory easily. It was more lateral than that. Two people who were both in the middle of figuring out a situation that neither had chosen, building a working vocabulary. Mia taught her where the good trail was for spotting deer in the morning. Evelyn taught her how to keep accounts, the simple ledger-keeping that was her own most reliable skill, the way you make a column for what comes in and a column for what goes out, and you make sure the numbers tell you the truth even when you'd rather they didn't. "Why does it have to balance?" Mia asked one afternoon, frowning at the little notebook Evelyn had given her. "Because the world is going to try to confuse you about what things actually cost," Evelyn said. "Writing it down means you can't be fooled." Mia thought about this. "Mama said writing things down makes them real." "Your mama was a smart woman." "I know." A pause. "Were you smart when you were little?" Evelyn considered the honest answer. "I was stubborn," she said. "Smart came later, mostly from making expensive mistakes." Mia seemed to find this more encouraging than a simpler answer would have been. Rowan watched these exchanges from the periphery with the careful attention of a man who doesn't want to disturb something fragile by looking at it too directly. He and Evelyn had developed their own separate accommodation over the weeks, a working ease that had grown from necessity and then kept growing past it, into something neither of them had explicitly named or was quite ready to. They moved around each other in the small space of the cabin with a naturalness that had surprised her, given that they'd been strangers 40 days ago. He told her things about the mountain, about the trapline, about the territory, not as lecture but as conversation, sharing information the way people do when they've decided the other person is worth informing. She told him about the boarding house, about her father, about the 3 years of slow drowning and stubborn refusal to let the water win. "Why didn't you leave?" he asked one evening, when the fire was low and Mia was asleep. "Silver Creek. When it got bad. You could have gone somewhere else, started over." She turned her cup in her hands. Where would I go? Anywhere, Denver, further west. And do what? Something. The same thing you do here, somewhere with better odds. She looked at the fire. My father built that boarding house, she said. Not well, and not for me. And the last years of his life, he mostly used it as a reason to borrow money he had no intention of repaying. But he built it. She paused. I couldn't figure out how to leave something that someone had built, even if the building was mostly a burden. Does that make sense? Yes, he said without hesitation. She looked at him. This cabin, he said simply. And she understood. The mountain, the trap lines, the life he'd built up here that most people in Silver Creek considered one step removed from living like an animal. He'd built it, and it was his. And the measure of a thing isn't always whether it's comfortable. We're not that different, she said. No, he agreed. I noticed that somewhere around the second day. The federal hearing was scheduled for late February, 12 weeks after the stay was issued, which Aldous Crane said was actually quick for federal procedure and which felt, to the people living in a mountain cabin counting down to it, like a geological era. Crane came up to the cabin once, in January, making the trip on snowshoes with a young associate who looked like he'd never been above 5,000 feet and was reconsidering his career choices as a result. He was a small, thin man in his 60s with bright eyes and the rapid, precise speech of someone who had learned to say things exactly once because he didn't have time to repeat himself. He went through the documents with Evelyn for 4 hours, while Rowan provided background and Mia sat in the alcove with her notebook, occasionally adding things in her small, careful handwriting that she would later show to no one. The jurisdiction argument is solid, Crane said, at the end of the 4 hours, with the grudging respect of a man who doesn't give compliments as a social gesture. The federal registration preempts territorial custody jurisdiction over the asset, which effectively weakens the basis for Whitmore's entire filing. Can we win? Rowan asked. Crane looked at him. Winning in federal court means different things at different stages. At this stage, winning means the custody determination gets remanded to federal family statute, which requires a much higher burden for displacing an existing guardian than the territorial standard Whitmore was counting on. He turned the amended claim registration over in his hands. Given the evidence of your established guardianship, the marriage, the property, and the fact that Whitmore's supporting affidavits appear to have been manufactured, a pause. I'd rather be in your position than his. That's not an answer, Rowan said. No, Crane agreed, but it's the honest version of one. February came. The days lengthened by small degrees, the light changing in the way it does toward the end of winter. Not warm yet, not even close, but angled differently, carrying a hint of something eventual. The cabin's woodpile had been worked down to a third of its original height, which Rowan rebuilt methodically through the cold weeks, and which Mia helped with in a limited capacity that was mostly about handing pieces over in the correct order, which she had decided was an important role and argued for vigorously when it was suggested she might be cold. The night before they were to leave for Greystone in the federal hearing, Mia couldn't sleep. Evelyn heard her the same way she'd heard her that first morning, the shift of weight, the too careful stillness of a child who doesn't want to be heard being awake. She got up, fed the fire, and sat at the table. After 5 minutes, the curtain moved and Mia came out. She sat down across from Evelyn. Her face had the particular scrubbed look of someone who had been crying and was not going to mention it. Evelyn didn't mention it. Can't sleep? I keep thinking about the hearing, Mia said. What about it? What if they decide wrong? She looked at her hands on the table. People decide wrong. Judges decide wrong. Yes, Evelyn said. They do. Mia looked up at her, surprised, maybe, that she hadn't offered a reassurance instead. But we've done everything right, Evelyn said. Your mother did everything right. The documents are correct. The filing is proper. The argument is sound. Sometimes the right thing doesn't win, but we've given it every possible chance. Mia was quiet. Then, what happens to me if they decide wrong? Evelyn looked at the child across the table. She thought about the answer she wanted to give, and the answer that was true and decided, as she generally did, in favor of the true one. Then we fight it in the next court, she said, and the one after that, until we run out of courts, which is not something that happens quickly in this country. She looked at Mia directly. And while we're fighting courts, you stay here, with us. That part doesn't change regardless of what a judge says tomorrow. Mia sat with this for a moment. You didn't have to stay, she said. It came out small, almost like she hadn't meant to say it. Evelyn considered deflecting, decided against it. No, she said. Not after the first week, maybe. I could have gone back to Silver Creek. Why didn't you? The answer was complicated in ways that Evelyn was still sorting through herself. The documents, and the legal fight, and the practical reality that leaving mid-battle was not something she was constitutionally capable of. But underneath all of that, there was something simpler and harder to say. Because you drew a picture with 3 people standing outside a cabin, she said, and none of them were going anywhere. Mia looked at her for a long moment with those careful, old-for-7 eyes. Then she got up from her chair, crossed the small distance of the table, and leaned against Evelyn's side with the specific economy of a child who has decided to trust something and is doing it as plainly as possible without ceremony. Evelyn put her arm around her and looked at the fire and did not say anything, because there are moments that talking walks through and ruins. They left for Greystone at dawn. All of them this time. Mrs. Alderley declining the trip but wishing them something that functioned as a blessing without using the word. Mia rode between Rowan and Evelyn on the sled. Wrapped in so many layers she was approximately spherical, watching the mountain come down around them as they descended toward the valley. The federal hearing lasted 2 days. It was not dramatic in the way that the cabin's porch had been dramatic, or the ambush on the trail, or even Evelyn's first conversation with Rowan at the bar of the Miner's Rest. It was the drama of rooms and documents, of men in good coats making precise arguments to a federal judge named Eleanor Marsh, who had sharp eyes and the specific patience of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that the person who talks fastest is not always the person who is right. Whitmore's lawyers were good. Crane had not oversold them. They argued the jurisdictional question with impressive technical facility, found 3 cases that superficially supported their position, and submitted 17 affidavits as to the unsuitability of Rowan's guardianship, most of which Crane systematically dismantled with a precision that Evelyn found almost beautiful in its efficiency. Anna's documents were entered into federal record. The amended claim registration, the witness affidavit, the correspondence from the Denver Land Office, the confirmation number that traced back to a registrar who was still employed and able to verify his own signature, each one landing on the record with the quiet weight of things that had been true the whole time, waiting to be acknowledged. Judge Marsh recessed after the second afternoon and returned with her ruling the following morning. She was brief. Evelyn had the impression she'd made the decision sometime during the first afternoon and had spent the subsequent 18 hours writing it precisely enough that it wouldn't be easy to argue with. The territorial court's emergency custody order was voided on jurisdictional grounds. The silver claim and associated lands were confirmed as under federal protection as Mia's inheritance. Custody was affirmed jointly in Rowan and Evelyn Blackridge, with no mechanism available under federal family statute for Silas Whitmore's petition. The ruling found his supporting affidavits to contain material inconsistencies, which was the judicial language for what Evelyn and everyone else in the room understood to be fabrications. Whitmore sat at the opposing table and did not move while this was read. He was a man who had never, in a very long life, run out of moves, and he was now confronting the specific texture of having run out of them in a specific direction. His lawyers were already leaning in, speaking quietly, pointing at things in their files. The appeal, the next argument, the continuation. He would not stop. Men like Whitmore did not stop. But he had been turned, and the thing he'd been reaching for had been closed to him. And the empire of influence he'd built locally had no weight here in this federal courtroom, and he knew it. He looked across the room at Evelyn. She looked back. She was sitting next to Rowan, with Mia on her other side. Mia, who had been allowed in the gallery and had sat with her hands folded in her lap for 2 days, with the concentrated stillness of someone who understands that the adults around her are handling something important, and that her job is not to add to the difficulty. When the ruling was read, Mia had gone very still, and then she had turned and looked at Evelyn with an expression that asked a question her voice wasn't ready for. Evelyn had nodded. Yes, that's what it means. And Mia had turned back to face the front of the courtroom, and she had not cried, but her small shoulders had changed shape, dropped, released, The particular physical shift of a burden that has been carried so long the person carrying it stopped noticing the weight until it was gone. Whitmore looked at Evelyn across the courtroom, and she held his gaze in the same way she'd held it on the courthouse steps, and on the cabin porch, and at the bar of the Miner's Rest on the night that all of this had started. Steadily, without performance, just present and not moving. He looked away first. It wasn't victory, exactly. She knew better than to call it that, knew the appeals would come, knew the legal machinery was slow and expensive and not yet finished. But it was something. It was the moment when the weight of the thing shifted from the people who'd been holding it up by sheer effort to the structure that was supposed to hold it, which was the law doing the thing the law was built to do, imperfectly and slowly and occasionally, but doing it. They walked out of the federal courthouse into a February afternoon that had, without much warning, turned towards something that might eventually become spring. Not warm. The air still had teeth. But the light was different, the angle of it less punishing. The shadows longer in the way that means the sun is climbing again, even if you can't quite feel it yet. Mia held both their hands for the first block, which she had not done before and did not draw attention to. Then she let go to climb a snowbank on the side of the road, because she was 7, and snowbanks required climbing regardless of what had just happened in a courtroom. Rowan watched her reach the top of it and plant her feet and look around at Greystone from this new elevation with the satisfaction of someone who has earned a vantage point. She'll want to know everything, he said, when she's older. All of it. She should know it, Evelyn said. Her mother did everything right. She should know that. He was quiet for a moment, then, the cabin. What about it? It's not, he paused, choosing. It's not what you had in mind when you came to terms, I know that. You had a boarding house, a life in town. I had debt and a crumbling boarding house, she said. Let's be accurate. Still. He looked at her sideways, with the particular unguarded quality she'd come to know meant he was about to say something he'd been deciding about for a while. I'm asking what you want. Going forward, not what the arrangement requires, what you actually want. She looked at Mia on her snowbank, surveying her temporary kingdom. Thought about the cabin in the morning, the way the light came through the east window, the sound of the fire, the small weight of a child leaning against her side in the dark. Thought about the accounts ledger she'd set up on the corner of the table, and the trapline maps Rowan had started explaining to her without being asked, and the way the mountain looked at dusk when the light turned everything briefly gold before it went. I want to go back to the cabin, she said, and then I want to figure out what we're doing properly. Not the arrangement, the actual thing. He looked at her for a moment. The actual thing, he repeated. Yes. That'll take some time to determine. I've got time, she said. I cleared my schedule. The almost laugh happened again. Slightly less almost this time. Almost a full one. She thought that eventually, given sufficient provocation, it might become an actual laugh. She was prepared to wait for that. Mia slid down the back of the snowbank and appeared around its edge with snow on her coat and a look of complete satisfaction. Can we eat? She asked. I'm hungry. Yes, Rowan said. Good. She fell into step between them as they moved down the street, her boots making small holes in the crusted snow. When we go back, can I see the trap lines? In spring, Rowan said. When the snow's down. You said that before. And I meant it both times. Mia considered this with the measured acceptance of a child who has learned that some promises are structural rather than immediate. Not broken, just slow. She had learned, in the months since her mother died, the difference between people who said things and people who meant them, and she had quietly rearranged the world into those two categories with the precision of someone for whom the distinction mattered more than almost anything else. She reached up and took Evelyn's hand without looking at her, simply finding it, the way you find something in the dark that you've come to know the location of. Evelyn held on. The street of Greystone went on around them, ordinary and indifferent, full of people who did not know what had just happened in a federal courtroom and would not have found it remarkable if they had. 3 people walking to find somewhere to eat, in February, in a territorial town, on a road that connected to other roads that eventually connected to everything. Not remarkable, but then the things that matter rarely look remarkable from the outside. A woman in a saloon asking the right question. A tin box under a floorboard. A child's drawing of 3 figures outside a cabin. A hand found in the dark. Months later, when the appeals were exhausted and the last of Whitmore's legal challenges had been dismissed, his empire contracting without the silver claim at its center, the political allies finding other alliances, the hired men finding other employers. There was no ceremony about it, no moment of formal resolution. Crane sent a letter that said the matter was concluded, and Evelyn read it at the table while Mia drew beside her and Rowan came in from the trapline with cold hands and a look on his face like a man who has been outside a long time and is glad to be in. She handed him the letter. He read it, set it down, looked at her. "Done," he said. "Done," she agreed. Mia looked up from her drawing. "What's done?" "Everything," Evelyn said. "For now." Mia looked between them with the assessing eyes that she'd have her whole life, the ones that could read a room before she was old enough to know what she was reading. Then she looked back at her drawing, which today was of the traplines in spring, rendered in approximate geography and ambitious color. "Good," she said, and went back to the work of imagining what came next. The fire burned, the mountain held. Outside, the spring that had been building under the snow for months was finally, slowly, beginning to show itself. In the melt at the south edge of the clearing, in the mud at the base of the woodpile, in the sound of water running somewhere under the ice that had covered it all winter, patient and persistent and entirely sure of where it was going. Some things don't resolve cleanly. Some things don't end so much as settle, find their weight and level and rest. The fear that had driven a man into a frontier saloon with a bag of gold and no good options doesn't disappear because a judge signs a paper. The grief of a child who lost her mother doesn't close like a door. The habit of doing everything alone, of keeping the wall up and the feelings below the waterline, doesn't undo itself in a season, but it changes. Slowly, under pressure, the way everything changes under pressure, not into something perfect, but into something truer than it was. A woman who had confused stubbornness for survival learning that they aren't the same thing. A man who had confused silence for strength, finding out that it's only strength when it protects something, and not when it just protects itself. A little girl drawing pictures of where she lived with everyone in it going nowhere. That was the whole of it. Not a fortune, not a legend, not the kind of story that gets told in saloons with the details improved by repetition. Just three imperfect people in a cabin on a mountain, with a fire burning and the spring coming and the long ordinary work of a life ahead of them, which was, in the end, the only kind of story that was ever really true.
Alright, ready?
I'm ready.
No, fucking monster! Run!
He's friendly as long as you don't get touch him. Oh.
What a bunch of idiots, bro.
It's just a spore lizard.
What did Max just send me?
Chandler?
Little.
Oh. Here, you can have your flashlight back.
I hope it's not bad. Max, what did you just send me? Johnny Walker edits? Are we all installing mods to play together as friends? Not tonight, but we will in the future. Not tonight, but in the future, yes.
Why can other people go through the caves?
Oh, that's not good.
There's two thumpers
And they left. Oh no.
and a fucking spring head. And a spring head.
Dude, what is happening with Ben, bro? Oh, damn.
My god, man.
Unfucking livable, bro. Dude, I fell in a hole. There was one, I jumped and there just happened to be a hole at the very bottom. I was pissed.
Rip. Just two fucking thumpers to spring it, and then they just fucking abandoned me.
Dude, they literally pulled that lever and just let you die, bro. That's crazy.
Motherfuckers.
Oh, something's on sale.
What the fuck is a stun grenade?
stun grenades are on sale?
Pop-up ad.
They always take the long way, bro.
They do.
The fuck is that?
Hold on, I'll be right back. I want ice cream.
Can we just fall down this hill?
If you come over here, you can slide down for sure. Did James also die?
I haven't heard of it in a while.
I'm gonna assume both of them are dead.